This podcast is brought to you in part by a generous supporter of the Monarch School. The mission of the Monarch School is to educate students impacted by homelessness and to help them develop hope for a future with the necessary skills and experience for personal success. Monarch has served San Diego County for 30 years, beginning as a one-room drop-in center and growing into a comprehensive K-12 school. Nearly 300 students attend school each day at their Barrio Logan campus, where they learn academic, social, emotional, and life skills. To learn more, visit monarchschools.org.
Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast, where we make sense of local politics, schools, housing, public safety, the civic issues that impact the life of a San Diego resident. We break it down so you can understand it and make educated decisions.
Everything that goes into our investigative reporting, the journalists, public records requests, the data crunching, and this very show depends on the support of people like you because we're a nonprofit news organization. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to those of you listening on News Radio 600 Kogo. This is the Voice of San Diego on podcasts and on radio. And I'm here with I'm Scott Lewis, and I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, my man?
What's up, brother?
Not a lot. Not much. Just recording a podcast.
And just about to have a kid.
Yeah, it's getting ever closer.
My kid is my son, Xavier. He's almost 7 now.
Uh-huh. Is he almost 7?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he's...
I would have guessed 4.
Yeah.
And that Ruby was 2.
Yeah, it just keeps going. Everyone says it goes fast. It really does go fast.
Yeah.
Except for the first few months of darkness and pain.
I have vastly approaching.
So he's really into fishing. I fished when I was a kid with my uncle and dad, but didn't really learn anything. I just did it.
Yeah.
And didn't keep with it, to the point where I learned. And so I've been trying to pick it up, and we've been to the pier in the bay at Shelter Island like 6 times now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going well. Not a single one. We walk up every time.
Still no fish.
Still none.
Not a one.
I went against Sunday. So we walk up every time, and we're like chanting, like, gonna catch a fish today, gonna catch a fish today. And everybody's like laughing with us, and it's fun. And, 3 hours later, he's like slumped in his chair, and I'm just cursing. And this guy next to us just reeling him in.
Just one
like,
fish
one
after another.
time. He just puts it out there, and he's like, oh, here we go. And it's like, shut up. And I'm just like, so finally.
I'm glad that is at least happening, or else Xavier is just like, what, is this a prank? Yeah. Is like there's no such thing as fishing?
Yeah. This guy, this last time we went, pulls in this gigantic halibut. And he's like, his string, he's like trying gently to pull it up so the line doesn't break. It's just like, and Xavier's just wide-eyed and gawking the whole time. And he's talking about, his kid is really picky eater, and he's talking about all the fish he wants to eat. And I'm like, I want to get fish protein into him, and I can't do it. So I went afterwards, and I just sucked it up, and I just went to the tackle box place and just said, just teach me. Please teach me.
How do I fish?
And so they set me up. Going again Saturday.
Yeah.
Going to make it happen.
All right. Saturday. That's the big day.
Well, and then we're going camping next week. Camping, quotes, at one of our favorite beach spot. And so we're going to do a little surf fishing too. I'm sure that'll be easy.
I hope this is about to turn around for you.
Thanks, Andy.
I want you to get those dad points.
Everyone's trying to reassure me that he'll just care that I went with him. And I don't think that's true. I think I need to catch a fish.
Well, I tell you, like, my old man was never into like outdoorsy stuff. Just like wasn't his thing. And I think like he put up with going fishing with me one time. It was like the same thing. But I like after that it was just like a flat refusal. It was just like, well, we don't know how to fish.
It's just a fact.
Just like, well.
Right. Well, I crossed the line where I'm actually into it now. So let's see if I can pull it off.
Okay.
Got a great show. We talked to the John Houston, the investigator of the investigative team that did the report on Sandag.
Yep.
He's coming online to tell us about his process with that. But first, we wanted to talk about pot. So this is, I really don't think people are grappling enough with the culture and legal change that's about to come, or the tumult that'll come if it doesn't come. Well, so there are people
who are like involved in public affairs who maybe aren't grappling with it quite as much as they should, and that is alarming.
Yeah.
And then but then there's also like the broader public who probably just like sees these news stories that are like, this is happening really quickly in the last 10 years. Such and such states have passed their own laws, as if everything takes care of itself after that ballot proposition goes through.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it doesn't take care of itself. It's very messy.
Yeah, there is a lot going on. So and then there's a third group, which is like the people who are trying to make lots of money right now and trying to position themselves. And a lot of them are going to lose big. But there's lobbyists and brokers and investors, all kinds of people trying to make it happen right now.
And like commercial real estate
Yeah.
brokers, like people that are not your conception of who's involved in the marijuana industry, just like straight businessmen who recognize the amount of new money that's come into this world.
And businesswomen.
Yeah.
And
no, you're right.
But there's a lot of investors and these people that want to stay one step away from it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They want to like not be involved in actually handing cannabis to people or growing it or distilling it.
Whereas the money
whatever.
that comes from that exchange, they're very excited about.
They're stoked about that part of it. So a couple of things. Let's just lay the groundwork. Right now, under California law, you are allowed to grow 6 plants of marijuana, and you're allowed to have that marijuana in your hand.
Yeah, which I guess means that at the point of the transaction, something is potentially illegal is happening. But when you turn and walk away from it, then you're in the clear.
And I think that's the going theme of this whole topic is that there's a line where what you're doing is illegal.
Yeah.
And there's a line where it's not. And I mean, well, on the other side, it's not. But nobody knows where that line is.
Yeah.
And if somebody tells you they do know, they're wrong.
Yeah.
So let's explain a couple of things that have come up. First of all, there's the big thing that everybody in California is marching towards is decisions at the local level and at the state level about what can happen where. So where can you sell it? Where can you deliver it? Who can deliver it? Who can manufacture it? Where that can all happen, right? And so San Diego, the city of San Diego, September 11th, will be having a discussion and perhaps a vote after that about the city of San Diego's own regulations about where adults can get cannabis without medical recommendations. Okay?
Okay.
So that's something to look forward to or that's coming. But meanwhile, there's still just a lot of big questions. So one of the things that happened about a week ago is San Diego police busted a delivery service. And so this was at 3487 Kurt Street in the Midway area. They found 41 pounds of high-grade marijuana, 8,000 edibles. This was a delivery service. Now, this was a little different because they also found cocaine, which is not allowed under any law right now.
No, not in this or any other state.
Not supposed to do cocaine or
just
sell
illegal.
it.
Yeah.
So
that one's simple. That's the simple part of the law.
Yeah.
Cocaine illegal.
Still out.
Yeah.
But it raised a question like, so are delivery services illegal? Because we're talking a lot about dispensaries in different spots. But the big thing is delivery.
Yeah.
There's apps, there's websites, there's call centers, all kinds of things.
Billboards advertising their apps and call centers.
Exactly. And so we poked around a little bit. Adriana Heldis in our shop helped me a little bit. We're trying to grasp what is legal right now about delivery. Basically, the only delivery services that are allowed in the city of San Diego right now are the ones attached to the legally permitted dispensaries. So we talked to the head of the delivery, it's called the Delivery or the Cannabis Delivery Alliance, the CEO of the San Diego Cannabis Delivery Alliance, Elizabeth Wilhelm. And she explained that she thinks there's about 300 delivery services in San Diego.
It's a lot.
Right now.
It's a lot.
And that maybe 20% of them are doing everything legally they should to be licensed. I think that's kind of high because I don't think there's that many dispensaries. I don't know how that works.
300 would be a lot. People often say that there are maybe too many, maybe a bubble of craft breweries in this county. There's 150 of those. So 300 would be twice as many illegal marijuana dispensaries.
Yeah, deliveries.
Deliveries, sorry.
Yeah. So
well, not all of those would be illegal, but in any case, you understand.
So
context.
So two things. Then we see that the city and the police are going to crack down on some of these illegal ones, obviously.
Yeah.
And then I think what you'll start to see then is a consolidation occur where the illegal delivery services sell or whatever their contacts and clients and stuff to these license firms. So you're going to see this. You're going to see the rise of local marijuana moguls.
Okay.
So that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Kinsey, this was a crazy story. Kinsey Moreland lives in Lemon Grove. And so there's all these places around the county where some of the marijuana entrepreneurs are trying to figure out where they'll be allowed to have both dispensaries and facilities, right? And so they're bidding up real estate prices and looking for those spots. And one of those spots is Lemon Grove.
It's close to the city, right?
Right. But Lemon Grove passed regulations that say they have to be 1,000 feet away from daycares.
Mm-hmm.
And then they produce this map. It's a hilarious map of where you can have these dispensaries. And it's just a big blob of where you can't.
Yes. There's like a couple specs that you're like, yeah. I guess that's okay.
And the reason that is because you're not allowed to have them 1,000 feet within daycares. And so a lot of the daycares are not like registered on like any database.
Right.
They're just known.
In-home daycare is a few kids, right?
So some of these entrepreneurs are going house to house to seek these out and offering cash to these daycare operators
to just shut down
or move.
Yeah.
And I think some of them are taking them.
Yeah, it's so first of all, like when I read it, that it was just like a fantastic anecdote that Kinsey found out. I can't believe that. But it also, and I'm not certain that this has happened at all, but it does produce some perverse incentives where you could, if you didn't want a dispensary to open in your neighborhood, you could just claim that you were in fact a daycare center.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you just wanted some money, you could just claim that you were a daycare center. Because these are necessarily places that don't exist on any database.
Yeah.
So there's no record of whether you are or are not.
Right.
So it's just a personal transaction at that point. So you could just say, yeah, I run a daycare here. I'll take $20,000, please.
And again, this intersection of what's allowed and what's not and what's going to happen and what's not and us figuring that out is very much alive right now. It's just this weird, demilitarized zone. It's just uncomfortable as far as what's going to shake out.
And I assume that some of these situations were present in Colorado and some of them have been sorted out and maybe some of them are of ongoing concern.
Yeah.
Same in Washington. But boy, being in it in the moment it's awfully disconcerting.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, how's anybody going to get all this stuff straightened out?
Well, and also because it basically then falls to city attorneys and prosecutors and police and to some extent politicians to code enforcement,
city staffers, city planners and development services people who, handle business licenses and make sure that, permits are proper, like mid-level bureaucrats.
So they just have to decide where the line is because there's no clear line. And that brings us to another story we did this week, Jonah Valdez. And Jonah tracked down the case. So I did a podcast for I Made It in San Diego, our new podcast. Mm-hmm. It's basically about entrepreneurs who have made it. And I did it on this really well-known pioneer in the medical marijuana industry and marijuana world, James Sladek. And I didn't have any idea that the moment I'd be done recording that, he would get prosecuted.
Yeah.
And he did get prosecuted. Did you listen yet?
I did. It was quite good.
Okay, good. It's really good story. This guy's entrepreneurial roller coaster is incredible. So he gets prosecuted, but here's the really interesting part that Jonah wrote about this week. Not only did James Sladek get prosecuted, his attorney has gotten prosecuted. So James Sladek was involved in, creating products based off of oil that he had delivered in, he said, to the shop, and would create things. There's a lot of cartridges and things that people are are using instead of just burning the actual bud weed.
Yeah.
And he talked, and so what he says that he was being all upfront and that they had permits, that the police had investigated and inspected his operation, and it was all fine. They say now that he, though, was creating illegal hash oil, was manufacturing something illegally. So it's not that he was involved in marijuana illegally, it was that he was manufacturing a controlled substance illegally.
Right.
And health and safety codes along with that. But here's the big part. They allege also that his attorney, Jessica McElfresh, was criminally conspiring with him.
Yeah.
And that that she was also guilty or is guilty of a felony.
Right.
So they're prosecuting her. And it's all based on one email that she sends him after an inspection of the city comes in, and she's like, I didn't have to do anything weird to get through that inspection. We did a really good job of giving them plausible deniability, and it was clear to them it wasn't a dispensary. So they say that was just an email saying, like, we were worried they would think we were a dispensary. We were not a dispensary. But then the prosecutors are looking at it saying, like, they tried to hide something from us.
Yeah.
Now, the big issue with that is that they're now going or trying to see all of her communications, attorney-client communications, which might also include all of the communications she's had with her other clients.
Yeah. And they went to her office and took her files, and now there's a third-party arbitrator that's kind of deciding what is and isn't related to this case. But that could eventually go to a judge, and if I read the story right, and if I understand it correctly, it could open up her communications with all of her clients in this realm.
So it sent a shudder across the legal community in San Diego, wondering what kind of precedent this sets for attorney. They say they've never seen anything like this, and it's just concerning about whether it's practicing that attorney-client.
Well, and not so it's pretty clear as day to see why, if you are an attorney who's been considering whether to get into this practice, you would have serious concern at this point. I would also venture that it makes your commercial real estate professionals and your would-be banking intermediaries and all of these people who might get in the ancillary business of marijuana saying, what am I gonna have district attorneys storming through my office?
Yeah, narcotics units.
It's just like, forget about it. I'll make less money.
Yeah, see, that's what's interesting is that, first of all, these lawyers already have to deal with the fact that marijuana is illegal and controlled and considered dangerous by the federal government.
Yeah.
And so they already, if they decide to work in this area, are taking the risk that working with it doesn't already condemn them as doing something against the law, which they're not supposed to do. They're lawyers.
Yeah.
And so they have to already handle that risk. And then there's this prosecutorial discretion that seems like the district attorney is communicating that the things that go along with this gray area of manufacturing, distributing quasi-legal marijuana is something we are going to hawkishly follow and prosecute, is going to send a chill through whether this really develops into a major industry in San Diego.
And there's an attorney that Jonah quoted that had an interesting point, which was that you're left at the county level with these elected prosecutors who have it upon their own discretion to essentially preempt what the voters of the state of California decided last year. The voters of California said pretty clearly that marijuana should be legal, and that isn't quite enough, that at the local level there's enough there's enough gray area in decision making to just say, well, no, which is an interesting way to run things.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to deal with the law.
It's fascinating, which gets to the larger federal issue as well, which is that it's that there is a tiny little thing stopping the federal government from enforcing its prohibition against marijuana, and that is this little budget amendment called the Rohrabacher Amendment, based off the guy in Newport Beach, the representative in Congress, Dana Rohrabacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an ally. He's part of the Cannabis caucus.
Mm-hmm.
And he put on this little thing that says that the federal government's not supposed to use federal dollars to investigate and enforce local marijuana stuff. And so that's a tiny little thing stopping Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, and Donald Trump from really cracking down on marijuana. But I tell you, that's not even that big a deal in my opinion. I think all it would take is a local U.S. attorney, whether it's in this area or Colorado or Oregon or whatever, who just decides I'm done with this, and unleashes the investigators, unleashes prosecutors, unleashes a lot of people to crack down on it. And it's not like Trump is going to say stop.
Right.
It's not like Sessions is going to say, no, we need to respect states' rights on this issue.
What about the Rohrabacher Amendment?
Yeah. So I think that's this whole world. So we have this march toward legalization happening.
Yeah.
And yet the federal government hasn't accommodated that. So there's that weirdness. And then there's local prosecutors and police that are just they're freelancing. They're just trying to figure it out. And so this is really going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and we haven't even reached 2018, which is the official rollout of the regulated market in the state.
Yeah.
And that's not that far away.
No, and so then you're talking about the moment that goes, as it has in Colorado, you're going to see a ballooning of the industry and the taxes it collects. So are you going to claw all that back?
Yeah.
And all the people getting in at this low level of distant, involvement and investment in this industry, what are they going to do? It's kind of crazy. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, the next thing to look forward to, of course, September 11th, when the city really grapples with this is the city of San Diego, its regulations on that. Now, we also talked to Elizabeth Wilhelm, again, the president of the Cannabis Delivery Alliance, about what she thought about that bust of the delivery service the other day. And she said, I'm 100% behind them shutting down anything that's illegal. It doesn't reflect well on the cannabis industry. You see a lot of that.
You do see a lot of that.
Let's get this regulated right so that we can be proud of what we do. So we'll see if they bust anybody that's right on that line of legality, if they keep with that sort of obvious, people breaking the rules kind of thing. And then, I think we're also going to be watching the federal issue, but also the taboo. Does the cultural situation change? Do you start to see, pot bars at weddings? You know what I mean?
That would be the full culture has fully shifted.
Right.
Marker. That's the thing to look for in 15 years.
Right. All right. Stay tuned for John Houston if you're on our podcast. This has been our partnership show with News Radio 600 Kogo.
This is Erin. I'm the Director of Development for Voice of San Diego. I'm here today with one of our sponsors, Tony Manilatis from Manilatis Nelson Murphy Advertising and Public Relations. You're a public affairs professional, so what do you think are the biggest public affairs issues facing San Diego? And are there any coming around the corner that we don't see yet?
Well, I think the biggest public affairs debates raging right now in San Diego obviously have to deal with homelessness and our housing crisis. And I don't think that those issues are going away anytime soon, unfortunately. We have a lot of people working on them, and there's been some progress, but boy, it sure would be nice if we were able to solve our housing crisis and our homelessness crisis. I think the other big public affairs debates that are in existence right now in San Diego obviously have to do with what's going to happen to Mission Valley. Is the MLS going to come to town? And what's going to happen with the convention center expansion? Is that ever going to get across the finish line? And then I think what's on the horizon, I think you're going to see a very robust public debate over our energy. And will San Diegans continue to get their energy from the utility, or will that be turned over to City Hall? And will City Hall get in the business of supplying our energy? I think that is going to be a debate we're going to hear a lot about in the coming months, and probably well into at least the early part of next year.
If you'd like to learn more about the services Tony and his partners offer, please visit their website, www.and&nbsp.com.
All right, our hero of the week. right, this week's hero is the Bridge Collaborative for Suicide Prevention and all the people organizing to try to get a barrier put up on Coronado Bridge to prevent suicides. So Coronado Bridge, as Coronado Mayor Richard Bailey and our own contributing reporter Randy Dotinga has pointed out, is the Coronado Bridge is about to cross this really macabre milestone to be the most deadly bridge in the country, as far as we can tell, because the Golden Gate Bridge is getting its own net system to prevent suicide deaths. So we got to do something about it. Something happened, as Randy notes, in 2011, 2012, where basically the number of people jumping off the bridge has doubled or more. And we're on track for a record year so far this year. And so, they basically describe it as like having a gun on the table. Like it's, if you can remove that you really can. It's not that they go somewhere else.
I think there's an idea that, we could prevent them from killing themselves this way, but they've still got a whole life to lead. And it turns out that the research kind of suggests otherwise, that you actually can, if you close off an option, that you could save someone's life.
There's a lot of sensitivity about talking about this issue in the media too. They don't like to report on it because they say it causes more to go out there. Please seek help if you're struggling with that. But anyway, to those of you, or to those people who are working on the prevention barrier and everything, we've got your back on that. That's a good effort. Our GOAT of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
This goes to the 5 city council members, Chris Ward, Chris Keatts, David Alvarez, Georgette Gomez, and Lori Zaff. The city council took up recently whether to repeal its Child Protection Act. This is a local law that restricts where convicted sexual offenders, I should say, can live and how closely within certain different things. The problem is the law seems to be illegal. In fact, the city attorney, Mara Elliott, advised the council that they should repeal the law because they're poised to be sued, and she doesn't think that they'll be able to win that lawsuit because it does, in fact, seem to be illegal. Adding to that, the city doesn't even enforce the law. It's just a law on the books right now, in part because it seemed the city attorney's office is concerned that it is illegal. And so the simple thing to do is to just repeal it. After all, it's not even in place anyway, and this lawsuit is coming, and your own city attorney is telling you that you're probably going to lose. And instead, these city council members voted not to repeal it. They stood by the law and said that they don't want to repeal it because they don't want sexual offenders living near children and that sort of thing, which really is, as City Attorney Mara Elliott said, providing false hope because, for one, it's not even in effect. It's not even in effect. And so that
they just don't want that mailer that says they voted against something like this, right?
Yeah, I think that's what happens.
Part of the GOAT is just that culture that we've created where these kind of votes, no matter how rational they might have been or whatever to deal with the problem, get distilled in these ways that they just cannot afford to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's I don't know. So it's going to cost the city legal expenses that they'll eventually lose. The other and the opponents' legal expenses, all for a law that isn't even enforced.
All right, we are going to do in the next couple of weeks a major push for funds, but if you want to get ahead of that, we could really appreciate it. This is a member support organization. We survive and thrive based on the people who listen and read the stories, listen to and read the stories that we do. So if you value anything we do, Morning Report, this podcast, or anything else, please consider going to voiceofsandiego.org/donate and becoming part of the 3,000 or so people who fund this. So please consider that. Andy's had a good run and need to keep paying him. And that means we need people to contribute. So thank you so much to those who already do. And if you got a few more bucks in there that you want to throw in, that would also be great. So big news this week. The executive director of the San Diego Association of Governments, Gary Gallegos, retired, announced he was stepping down. He will get a pension, so he's able to call that a retirement. Obviously, it comes right after the board decided to review his performance in regards to the investigative report that was released last week about the issue that you uncovered over quite some time. I guess it's about a year ago that we started investigating, right?
Yeah, it's coming up on a year ago, yeah.
So just let me see if I can do it this time. Basically, you uncovered that they were projecting to collect a lot more money, billions of dollars more, in last year's proposed tax increase that allowed them to sort of promise a lot more projects than maybe they would if they had been a little bit more honest about where the money was coming or how much was going to come in. And the fact is that the projections were just faulty.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, you also uncovered that the costs of projects that they were promising had also gone up without disclosure, and that the old tax increase that literally was passed in 2004, that projection of how much it would collect was also billions off as well. Fair enough?
Yeah.
We also learned from that investigative report that when you started investigating this, they started hiding documents and deleting some of them. We don't know exactly what they deleted. We're trying to figure that out. And all this really hit that climax last week with that report, which verified a lot of your investigative reporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we have John Houston.
Well, I should add. So Gary Gallegos announced that he was going to step down. There's still a great deal of indecision about what else is going to happen. The board made a number of suggestions in the face of this investigative report that came out. One was to review his employment. We now have an answer to that, although even still, when he leaves seems to still be up in the air, and what the terms of that departure are seems to still be up in the air. Whether they look into any other staff is still entirely up in the air, which was one of the things that was discussed. I presume that they'll still move forward with implementing some of the suggestions that were included in this report. There were more things discussed by the board than simply pushing out Gary Gallegos. So while he has decided to step down, that doesn't necessarily put a bow on that whole discussion.
Okay. So we interviewed John Houston from Houston Hennigan, the group that did this report. I want to just quickly define a couple of things that we talk about in that interview. One is this cost issue. So just to be clear, you guys talk a lot about that issue, about why they didn't investigate that. And this is the issue that you uncovered throughout this investigation, which was not about the projection of money that would come in. It was about the cost that they said all these projects would be, and whether it had gone up quite a bit, and they hadn't told the public. In other words, they were deceiving the public and maybe even matching funding organizations like the federal government about how much these shovel-ready projects would cost, right?
Yeah, and I'll clarify a little bit there. I've had people say to me like, well, what's the big deal? Costs go up on projects all the time. And that's, of course, true. What the issue here is that Sandag's board voted, Sandag's staff concluded that all of these projects had gone up in cost by $8 billion in October of 2015. Months later, at the beginning of 2016, when they updated their long-term outline of the future of Transnet, they still used the outdated costs. And that was at a time period when they were gearing up for the Measure A election, and so the status of Transnet and all of those projects was very important at that time, because any sort of doubt about whether it was on track would have opened up the question about whether Measure A's money would in fact go to paying back those old promises.
All right, and one other thing I wanted to describe, in October of last year, when you send in a records request.
Yeah.
And you guys in this interview talk about a meeting that happened the very day they got that records request.
Yeah.
We don't know that it was provoked by your records request, but it happened the very day.
Yes.
And at that meeting, there's a big discussion that sort of reminds people about what they can do to get rid of documents or hide or delete them, right?
Yeah, correct.
And so that's a meeting that you guys discussed. I just wanted to set the scene for people who listen to that interview and wonder what you're talking about with that meeting.
Okay.
All right, John Houston. Okay, we are joined on the line in the Great Voice San Diego podcast studio by John Houston from Houston Hennigan, the law firm that is based out of Southern California but does national work, and it was the group that did the investigative report that Sandag commissioned. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So just take a second and orient us. So the SANAG board says they want this sort of investigative report. How do you go about starting it? What did you do? How many interviews, that sort of thing?
Sure. So we got general, what I call scope directions from SANDAG as to what we should do. And we started from that and then did an initial investigation to determine whether, for instance, the early estimate of just 15 to 17,000 documents was going to be accurate. It turns out it wasn't. There were more than 55,000 relevant documents as we continued. We interviewed over 22 witnesses. We reviewed public accounts, including investigative reports from your publication that were very helpful in providing insight and other leads. And we pursued the investigation. And I will add, we did so without regard to our budget because we wound up deciding to investigate all issues pertaining to scope, and for costs above our budget, we wrote off the time and didn't bill SANDAG for it.
So all issues, you might mean some of the other things that we hadn't heard about, like the documents, sort of disclosures and secrecy and stuff like that?
Exactly. So a part of what in fact, one of the major portions of our presentation and investigation had to do with concerning accounts that we had from various interviewees about instructions they had for so-called record retention, which were interpreted as potentially record destruction directives, as well as the creation of the so-called HANA tools folder and what was involved in that. And we thought that was sufficiently related and really inextricably intertwined with many of the issues that we were working with. We thought it was imperative that we get to the bottom of those issues so that we could give fulsome guidance to the SANDAG board as to what kind of corrective measures need to be taken going forward by SANDAG.
So I want to get back to a couple questions on that specific part of this whole investigation in a second. But there's also a section in your report where you say, essentially, some witnesses brought up other issues, specifically the question of costs as it related to the Transnet Plan of Finance and when those were disclosed. And so how did you go about deciding what fell within the scope of work that didn't include those revelations that witnesses brought to you, but did include the record retention issues?
Right. So that's a very good question. So what I do, and this is not the first time this has come up. So for instance, with record deletion, potential record deletion, and the creation of a folder that by some witnesses was viewed as an effort to defeat the collection of documents that related directly to our area of inquiry, my view is, as in the words that I just used, they really were inextricably intertwined issues that reflected on management, judgment, and other issues of possible intentional misconduct that would together be relevant for the original scope of work. However, when somebody would volunteer something else that we thought was not directly connected, such as possible cost issues with Transnet, what we did is we made a clear notation in our report that was reported, but that we felt it was beyond the scope of our investigation, and then we're leaving it to SANDAG. They've now been flagged about the issue. We're leaving it to SANDAG to decide whether they want to authorize additional investigation for that area. And by including it in the report, then the public is made aware of the fact that this issue was raised by some of the interviewees.
Can you tell me anything about how that specifically came up, whether it was immediately volunteered, whether you had followed a line of questioning that brought it up? Like how exactly did the issue of costs and Transnet arise in your investigation?
Sure. When we conduct an investigation, as we tell all witnesses, we don't have an answer that we're looking for, and we don't have a set purpose for our questioning except to get to the bottom of all the relevant potential facts pertaining to the issue we're asking about. But at the end of the interview, I always ask people, is there anything else that you'd like to talk to us about, or something that you think might be relevant in your own mind that we have not mentioned? And that's consistent with making sure that people feel that they've got an adequate airing of all issues that they think may be concerning. And that's how this came up. I think, it's not uncommon for someone to say, well, now that you're asking me, I have an issue with this and that, and you might want to know about it.
Okay, and then so going back to the records issue, you mentioned that, I mean that section really does jump out of the report. It seems a number of witnesses raised pretty serious concerns. Some indicated to you that they believe pretty strongly that some emails were in fact deleted as a result of this conversation, and that the intent of storing everything in this folder called HANA Tools was expressly to keep them outside of the reach of public records requests. One question I have for you is that didn't come into the report. Did you get any sense of how often the SANDAG staff has these sorts of conversations around their public records policy, whether it's annually, every 6 months, whether it's something that comes up in meetings fairly regularly? Like how uncommon was this sort of conversation among staffers at this level in the first place?
So as I mentioned in the public presentation, I think I had a question along these lines that was related to this topic.
Yeah.
It was uncommon, which, as I underscored in my public presentation, made it even more of a concern to us that there was a quote-unquote reminder of retention policies at a time where SANDAG was under siege and clearly was receiving public records requests. And it is common for unschooled, unsophisticated employees to understand or receive those instructions as sort of a wink and a nod for them to go ahead and broadly destroy in a robust manner anything that they can arguably call something that falls into the retention policy that might yet be responsive to, say, the public records request. That was what was so problematic in part about this, that they didn't have regular training on this, and so bringing it up at that precise time was perceived as a message by many to look broadly for things to destroy.
I see. And so now one of the other things that was in your report that I had never written about and never investigated, but really dominates a lot of the word count of your report, is these years-long issues related to expertise on their forecasting problems and staff resources. And Gary Gallegos says in a few times, I think, to you that he wasn't aware of these things. There are other staffers who say, no, we definitely brought it up. I think Beth Jaros says that she mentions it in her exit interview. A couple different people say that they definitely would have elevated when they were leaving, that they would have reminded people about how much expertise was fleeing the agency and not being replaced. I mean, in general, how plausible do you think it is that executive leadership didn't realize that the composition of their professional staff here was really undergoing changes and, in their opinion, losing the resources they needed to do highly professional work?
Right. That's a great question. And I can tell you that we didn't find a smoking gun whistleblower letter that said, "Dear Mr. Gallegos, we are treacherously understaffed and balls are being dropped. DEFM is not being updated correctly. This is all in your hands." There was nothing like that. But my view is that it doesn't matter whether there was an express notification of executive leadership. I think as I presented this, whether it was known expressly or not, it should have been known. That was my point. And it was very important to lay out years worth of inadequate staffing. And I also pointed out that a number of the witnesses said they did report up to their immediate supervisors. And again, so the issue being embedded for so many years and competency in this core area being so central to SANDAG's mission and forecasts, for which the taxpayers are relying, regardless of whether the folks in executive leadership were put on express notice. My view is it's something they should have known about, should have acted upon, and had they, it is very likely the issues that unfolded recently would have been avoided.
And as a follow-up to that, there's this narrative that comes to life in your report that I imagine some people could say, well, in hindsight, all of these things are, of course, very obvious, but in real time they weren't. But the narrative that really comes to life to me almost sounds like a Malcolm Gladwell essay where there would be red flags and they'd be dismissed, and there were presentations that they were dismissed, and that consistently the reason that these things weren't being given the serious treatment that they maybe deserved, or the connections that they entailed weren't being explored, what was just this general deference to the strong personality of Marnie Cox, and that he had this long history with Gary Gallegos, and so Gary was willing to simply defer to the testimony of one person, even when it was in the face of a fully formed presentation chock full of data that, in the opinion of many people in that room, demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt that these results were unreasonable. And I wonder if you essentially agree with that take, and what you do with that in terms of an investigation that's looking for misconduct. Yeah,
sure. So part of what I was asked to do was to determine whether there was any intentional misconduct on the behalf of any of the employees or executives at Sandag with respect to knowing and possibly concealing the forecasting error. And so I was careful in investigating and looking to see whether there was deliberate misconduct. And instead, what I found was a series of very unfortunate lapses in judgment, as I called them, which ranged from negligence to questions of competence with respect to the leaders and each one of them. And the report chronicled our findings with respect to each of the leaders that were involved and made findings. It was my understanding that it is the board's responsibility to then evaluate what we have found in terms of the facts and decide whether there's a crisis in leadership and whether leadership needs to be changed. Those sorts of recommendations, such as this leader must go, are really not part of what I'm doing. I'm providing the facts and I'm calling balls and strikes on conduct, and then it's up to the board to decide what they do with that in terms of changes in leadership, whether they think that someone has other similar issues in other areas that I'm not aware about that might be now cause for termination, or whether there are mitigating facts, like this person, a particular person really has been an outstanding executive and hasn't had any other issues before at Sandag. That's the mix of facts that needs to be taken into account by the board in conjunction with the findings that I specifically made in my report.
In your report, Chief Economist Ray Major, when he finds out a few weeks after that December 2015 meeting that contrary to what may or may not have been said in that meeting, there's a discrepancy there, that he finds out conclusively that this forecast was used for Measure A, and that he at that point concludes to himself, and doesn't raise it up the ladder, but concludes to himself that forecast is not right.
That was a significant issue, and that's why I independently highlighted that in his presence at that hearing, at the presentation. I mean, that is a very, very significant issue, and one which, because I highlighted it, I expect the board to be taking that into consideration in determining what his continuing roles and responsibilities should be.
Yeah. And so, and then I want to turn it back to my my co-host Scott here. I've been talking for a while. Was there, during all this discrepancy, in whether in December or October, while this dispute was raging internally, did anyone say, well, as long as we're having this argument and conducting this research, maybe we should tell someone on the board at least that these conversations are happening?
nobody referenced or came up with that kind of thought or idea. And again, that's an issue for the board. And I think you saw some inquiries from board members. I think, the executive leadership and the board, I think, is planning to and should be sending the message that if there are issues like this where there appear to be possible failures in leadership, the answer is not to simply tuck the problem in a file and to move forward. You need to raise it, and if necessary, go to the board and know who to go to. And that's part of good governance, is a board that establishes the equivalent of a hotline and a report that goes directly to the auditor's subgroup so that they can ensure that issues are being tracked down regardless of items that may be missed by the responsible executive leadership.
There was a quote, the chairman, and I want to start transitioning to your recommendations, but there was a quote yesterday. The chairman of the Sandag Board of Directors, Ron Roberts, said after the news had come out that Gary Gallegos was stepping down, said, quote, "Gary's been made the scapegoat for something that none of us knew what was going on prior to the election." So he's been made the scapegoat for something that none of us knew what was going on prior to the election. I can tell you that, and I'm talking about it at the top. I've been reading that quote all morning long, and I'm still not quite grasping it. I think what he's saying is that there was no way that none of us, and by us he means the leadership, knew what you guys, Andy, and the investigators can say that some people did know. Help me understand what your interpretation of that quote might be, or what your reaction to it is.
Well, I assume he made this as an oral comment. It wasn't printed. I mean, the problem with it, because you're struggling with it too, is what does he mean by us? Does he mean the board? Does he mean executive leadership? Does he mean the entire organization? Obviously, I pointed out in my report there were many people aware at important staff levels of continuing issues, sometimes for a matter of years. And I think I also pointed out that leadership knew or should have known of these issues, with much of it being should have known. So, possibly and technically, he's stating, there is no evidence. One way to look at what he's saying is, well, gee, I haven't seen what I described earlier as some smoking gun where, Mr. Gallegos has been found to have known of a particular fact, and then he went and concealed it. On the other hand, I think the report shows the equivalent of lapses in judgment and potential drop balls by leadership. And of course, at the end of the day, and this is what is very difficult for a board in any organization, is sifting through those findings and then weighing, the good, bad, and the ugly of what that executive has brought to the table in many other contexts, and deciding whether that person must go. Mm-hmm. So the rest of that, outside of what I have investigated, I just don't know, and I'm sure is animating some of the debate behind this.
All right. So you had mentioned earlier when you're talking with Andy about the staffing issues, and you guys were trying to parse how much of that was known. Is the staffing in the professional and data and analytical ranks, is that strong enough right now based on what you learned?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So you guys were describing that the staffing and professional staff was struggling, that there was a crisis, that it had never reached necessarily the leadership level. And right. I'm just curious, did that get fixed? Are we at a point right now where Sandag has the staff it needs to do this work well?
I think they're on the road to doing that. As I mentioned in the public presentation, they have moved away from DEFM, and they are evolving a new model, the details of which are not yet known, and I do not know them. They've consolidated, I thought, in a very positive step, they consolidated the staffing functions under one person, and it's currently Ray Major. So you don't have silos where people working with the output of forecasts don't talk to and don't communicate issues and assumptions to those putting together the models of the forecast, which was one of the structural problems that I found over the course of those years. Now there is communication and understanding both sides real time. So I do believe some of the structural measures they had already begun to take was part of the pathway for a solution, but I'm not in a position to tell you because I don't know exactly what model they're adopting and who they're assigning to assess whether the new model and people assigned to it would be adequate.
And I just want to, this matters. This isn't just an organization and, its own performance. This is an organization whose data and models are used for so many other issues and conclusions by other agencies and developers and all kinds of people around the county. So that's why it's important to get right there. Now, the other question I have is about, you mentioned that there was no sort of outlet for staff concerned to go to a watchdog or an auditor or some sort of hotline, and that may have set the stage for a strong personality, whether it was Cox or Gallegos or somebody else, to really put the lid on some kind of problem. So has that been reconciled, or are you still concerned that function isn't there? And what would that look like if that was fixed?
Well, what I saw at the board presentation is an interest in several suggestions that they do make clear that there should be a reporting function directly to the board. And my understanding is that is going to be adopted and reinforced throughout SANDAG, and I think that is essential.
And so then the one other thing that comes up in the report is the public response from SANDAG after the fact, which is,
yes.
So there's the letter that Gary Gallegos sent to board members. There's the op-ed that Ron Roberts published on our website.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about how that kind of rose to the level that you wanted to address it, and what your concerns were with those responses.
So I think a number of our interviewees said that they were uncomfortable with some of the public messaging, especially the interviewees that were involved in identifying some of the issues. So we looked carefully at the actual messages sent and who wrote them and what kind of diligence was done. And unfortunately, it was not done with great diligence, and the people signing them had other people writing them for them and claimed that they did not feel it was part of their responsibility to otherwise further vet the accuracy of each and every one of the statements. And that's unfortunate. I think when any organization is making statements that they intend the public to rely on, and that's true of corporations, for instance, when they do, say, earnings reports, there are duties owed to, in this instance, the taxpayers to give a full, fair, and accurate account to best of your ability. And that means that you should be very, very careful in the statements that you issue. And if you're not prepared to issue a statement that you're confident is true in every respect, then you shouldn't issue a statement. So in this instance, we found one or two portions of each of those communications to simply be untrue by omission. But we did not find evidence that there was a calculated effort to deceive the public. It really was an unfortunate lack of diligence in the messaging and the construction of the message by those who signed.
And so then the last thing I wanted to ask about the public response is December 2016 now, so this is after the election, the staff brought forward a change to the Transnet plan of finance that incorporated this new forecast that they kind of aggregated from some outside forecasts, which changed their revenue expectations. They also, at this point, implemented the new cost expectations and showed that there was an issue. Did you look at that presentation at all? And if you did you find that to be sufficiently forthcoming?
No, we did not believe that effort was really within the scope of what we were told to do. Namely, really our timeline was ending at or about the time of the actual announcements, the election, and then the communications with respect to what had happened, and not the efforts that were made afterwards, including December.
Have they asked you to look into anything else or talk to you preliminarily about some of these other areas you thought about maybe were ripe for investigation?
We have not yet been asked to look at anything else. We're certainly happy to look at any and all areas that Sandag may suggest are worthy of further investigation.
John Houston from Houston Hennigan Law Firm, investigators of the Sandag issue. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Today's show was produced by me, Andrew Keatts, and Scott Lewis. It was recorded by Adam Greenfield in the Great Voice of San Diego podcast studio, where we also produce Good Schools for All and Kinsey Moreland's Culture Cast. Thank you to our partners at Kogo 600.
Like us, love us, maybe not Andy, maybe me, got some feedback? Let us know by rating and reviewing this show on iTunes. We value the feedback from our listeners so we can keep making a show you'll enjoy.